The grandfather clock in the corridor had been ticking for over 2 centuries, marking time through wars, celebrations, and countless family dramas. But on this particular Tuesday morning in March, its steady rhythm seemed to echo like a countdown to disaster. The palace staff moved through their duties with unusual quiet, their whispered conversations stopping abruptly whenever footsteps approached. Something was terribly wrong behind the ancient walls of the royal residence, and everyone could feel it. Prince William stood outside his father's private study, his hand frozen inches from the brass door handle. For the past 3 hours, no sound had emerged from within. No response to the gentle knocks from staff members, no acknowledgement of the increasingly urgent messages sliding under the door. The silence was deafening, and with each passing minute, the weight of responsibility pressed harder on his shoulders. What had begun as a routine family meeting the evening before had spiraled into something none of them could have anticipated. Now, as the future King of England, William faced a decision that could change the monarchy forever. Behind that locked door lay answers that the world was waiting for, but getting to them would require him to cross a line that no royal had ever dared to cross. The palace that had housed kings and queens for generations was about to witness an unprecedented moment. And it all started with a secret that was too dangerous to keep hidden any longer. The morning mist clung to the windows of Kensington Palace like a gray shroud, casting everything in an otherworldly light. Prince William had been awake since 4 a.m, pacing the length of his private apartment while Catherine slept peacefully in the next room. He envied her ability to find rest during times like these. But then again, she didn't know the full extent of what was happening. No one did, except for a select few who had sworn themselves to secrecy. The previous evening had started innocently enough. King Charles had requested a private family dinner, nothing unusual in itself. These gatherings happened regularly, a chance for the senior royals to discuss upcoming engagements, charitable initiatives, and family matters away from the prying eyes of staff and media. William had arrived at Clarence House at exactly 7 o'clock, as was his custom. Punctuality had been drilled into him since childhood, and he took pride in never keeping anyone waiting, especially his father. But something had been different from the moment he walked through the door. Charles had seemed distracted, distant even. His usual warm greeting had been replaced by a curt nod and a gesture toward the dining room. Prince Anne had been there too, her face carrying an expression that William had learned to recognize over the years. It was the same look she wore during family crises, a mixture of determination and barely controlled worry. The dinner conversation had been stilted, filled with long pauses and careful words. Charles had pushed his food around his plate without really eating, while Anne kept glancing at her watch, as if waiting for something. William had tried to lighten the mood with stories about George and Charlotte's latest adventures at school, but his attempts at normalcy had fallen flat. It wasn't until the staff had cleared the main course that Charles had finally spoken the words that changed everything. "There's something you both need to know," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, something that could affect the future of the monarchy itself. The revelation that followed had left William feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. For months, Charles had been dealing with a situation that went far beyond anything the royal family had faced in recent memory. It involved documents that had surfaced unexpectedly, papers that dated back decades and contained information that could unravel carefully constructed narratives about the royal family's history. The documents had been discovered during routine renovations at one of the lesser-known royal properties. Hidden behind a false wall in what had once been a private study, they contained correspondence, photographs, and records that painted a very different picture of events that the public thought they understood. If these papers were to become public, they wouldn't just cause embarrassment. They would fundamentally challenge the legitimacy of certain royal protocols and decisions that had been made decades earlier. Charles had been trying to handle the situation quietly, working with a small team of trusted advisors to verify the authenticity of the documents and determine the best course of action. But word had somehow leaked to certain media circles, and now there were journalists asking pointed questions about events from 40 years ago. The palace's usual strategy of never explain, never complain wasn't going to work this time. William had listened to his father's explanation with growing alarm. This wasn't just about protecting the family's reputation. These documents contained information that could call into question the very foundation of the modern monarchy. If they were published without context, without proper explanation, the resulting chaos could destabilize everything they had worked to build. But what troubled William most was his father's demeanor throughout the explanation. Charles seemed defeated, overwhelmed by the weight of decisions he felt incapable of making. For the first time in William's life, he saw his father not as the king, but as a man struggling under impossible pressure. The meeting had ended with Charles retreating to his study, claiming he needed time to think. That had been at 11 o'clock the previous evening. It was now approaching noon the next day, and no one had seen or heard from the king since. William had tried calling first, listening as the phone rang endlessly in his father's study. Then he had sent text messages knowing that Charles always kept his personal phone close by. When those went unanswered, he had driven to Clarence's house himself, using his key to enter through the private entrance that family members used. The staff had been relieved to see him. They had been growing increasingly concerned as the morning wore on. Charles had missed his breakfast appointment with his private secretary. He had failed to appear for a scheduled call with the Commonwealth representatives. Most alarming of all, he hadn't responded when they had knocked to inform him that his doctor had arrived for a routine checkup. Mrs. Henderson, Charles's longtime housekeeper, had approached William with obvious distress. She was a woman who had served the royal family for over 30 years, and in all that time she had never seen the king fail to acknowledge staff members who needed his attention. "He's always been so considerate," she had told William, wringing her hands. "Even on his worst days, he always responds when we knock. Something's not right, Your Royal Highness." William had made his way through the familiar corridors of Clarence's house, past the portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch his every move with judgment in their painted eyes. The house felt different today, charged with an energy that made everyone speak in whispers and move with exaggerated care. When he reached his father's study, he had knocked gently at first, then more insistently. "Father, it's William." He had called through the heavy wooden door. "We need to talk." But there had been no response. Not even the sound of movement from within. He had tried the door handle, but it was locked from the inside. This was unusual. Charles rarely locked his study door during the day, preferring to keep it open so that staff could enter as needed. The fact that it was locked suggested either that he wanted absolute privacy or something more concerning. Standing in the hallway now, William felt the weight of expectation from everyone around him. The staff were looking to him for leadership, for a decision about what to do next. His position as heir to the throne meant that in situations like this, people naturally turned to him for guidance. But this wasn't just about royal protocol or family dynamics. This was about a father who might be in trouble, who might need help, but was too proud or too overwhelmed to ask for it. William thought about the look in Charles's eyes the night before, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he had described the magnitude of the crisis they were facing. He thought, too, about the documents that had started all of this. Hidden for decades, they had emerged at exactly the wrong time, when the monarchy was still finding its footing under Charles's reign. The revelations they contained would be difficult enough to handle under the best of circumstances, but with mounting pressure from the media and growing public scrutiny of royal finances and privileges, they represented a potential catastrophe. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 12 times, each note seeming to emphasize the urgency of the situation. William knew that every minute of delay would only make things worse. If Charles was ill, if something had happened to him, then waiting could be dangerous. But if he was simply overwhelmed and needed space, then forcing entry into his private study would be seen as a violation of trust and respect. William closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center himself the way Catherine had taught him during their meditation sessions. He thought about his children, about the legacy he wanted to leave them. He thought about the thousands of people who depended on the monarchy for stability and continuity. Most of all, he thought about his father, alone behind that locked door, carrying the weight of secrets that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. When he opened his eyes, his decision was clear. Whatever the consequences, whatever protocol he might be breaking, he couldn't stand by and do nothing while his father suffered in silence. The future of the monarchy might depend on the documents hidden away for decades, but today, in this moment, it depended on the choices he was about to make. He turned to Mrs. Henderson, who had been waiting anxiously nearby. "Please clear the hallway," he said quietly, "and ask the security team to ensure our privacy." She nodded and hurried away, understanding the gravity in his voice. William stood alone before the locked door, his hand reaching toward the brass handle one more time. This time, he wouldn't just knock and wait. This time, he would do whatever it took to reach his father, even if it meant crossing lines that had never been crossed before in the long history of the royal family. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the normally quiet corridors of Clarence's house like a gunshot. William stood in the doorway of his father's study, his shoulder aching from the force he had used to break through the heavy oak door. The sight that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. King Charles sat slumped in his leather chair behind the massive mahogany desk, but he wasn't unconscious as William had feared. Instead, he was staring blankly at a collection of yellow documents spread across the desktop, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Empty teacups sat abandoned on side tables, and the room carried the stale smell of someone who had been confined in the same space for too long. "Father," William said softly, stepping carefully into the room. Charles looked up slowly as if emerging from a deep trance. For a moment his expression was one of confusion, as though he couldn't quite place where he was, or why his son was standing in his doorway with broken wood scattered at his feet. "William," Charles finally said, his voice hoarse and barely recognizable, "I didn't hear you knock." "I did knock, Father." "For hours. We've all been worried sick." William moved closer to the desk, his eyes taking in the scattered papers that had clearly been the focus of his father's obsessive attention. "What's going on here?" Charles gestured weakly at the documents. "I've been trying to make sense of it all, trying to find a way through this mess that doesn't destroy everything our family has built." He picked up one of the papers with trembling fingers. "Do you know what this is, William? This is a letter from your grandfather to a government minister in 1982. A letter that was supposed to have been destroyed decades ago." William took the paper his father offered, scanning the handwritten text that bore the unmistakable signature of Prince Philip. The contents made his stomach drop. It was a detailed discussion of a controversial political situation, one in which his grandfather had expressed strong personal opinions that went far beyond the constitutional role of the royal family. If this letter were to become public, it would violate every principle of royal neutrality that the monarchy claimed to uphold. "There are dozens more," Charles continued, his voice growing more agitated. "Letters, memos, photographs, evidence of political interference, financial irregularities, personal relationships that were kept secret from the public. 40 years of carefully hidden truths that someone has now decided to expose." William set the letter down and pulled a chair closer to his father's desk. "Who found these documents? How did they surface after all this time?" Charles rubbed his temples, a gesture William recognized from his own moments of stress. "The renovation work at Frogmore House. They were installing new electrical systems and had to remove some of the older paneling. The contractor found a hidden compartment behind one of the walls. Inside were several boxes of papers that should have been in the Royal Archives, except they were marked as destroyed." The implications hit William immediately. Someone had deliberately hidden these documents, keeping them secret while officially reporting them as destroyed. That suggested a level of planning and deception that went far beyond simple oversight. Who had access to that room? Who would have known about the hiding place? "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Charles said, gesturing at the papers scattered across his desk. "The room was used as a private office by several family members over the years. Your grandfather kept some of his correspondence there. I used it occasionally when I was younger. Even your grandmother had meetings there sometimes when she wanted complete privacy." William studied his father's face, noting the exhaustion and desperation in his eyes. "Father, how long have you known about this? When did these documents first surface?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with shame. 3 months ago. The contractor who found them was discreet enough to contact the palace directly rather than going to the media. But word has been spreading since then. There are people who know these documents exist, and they're asking questions we can't answer without revealing their contents. 3 months? William couldn't hide his shock. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have been working together to find a solution." "Because I hoped I could handle it quietly," Charles replied, his composure finally beginning to crack. "I thought if I could just study the documents carefully enough, understand their context, maybe I could find a way to explain them that wouldn't cause irreparable damage. I've been meeting with historians, legal experts, crisis management specialists. But every option they present seems to make things worse." William began to understand the magnitude of the pressure his father had been under. For 3 months, Charles had been carrying this burden alone, trying to protect the monarchy and the family while facing the possibility that decades of carefully maintained public trust could be shattered by the revelation of these hidden truths. "What exactly are we dealing with?" William asked, settling into his chair for what he sensed would be a long and difficult conversation. "What's in these documents that's so damaging?" Charles reached for a manila folder and opened it carefully. "Political interference from the 1980s that contradicts our public stance of neutrality. Financial arrangements with foreign governments that weren't properly disclosed. Personal relationships involving family members that the public was never told about." He paused, looking directly at his son. "And evidence that some of the official royal histories we've published over the years contain deliberate inaccuracies." The weight of these revelations settled over William like a heavy blanket. Each category of document represented a potential scandal that could dominate headlines for months. Together, they painted a picture of a royal family that had been far more involved in political and financial controversies than the public had ever known. "There's something else," Charles continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Some of these documents suggest that your grandmother was aware of certain situations but chose not to address them publicly. If that becomes known, it could tarnish her memory and everything she worked to achieve during her reign." William felt a surge of protective anger at the thought of his grandmother's legacy being attacked. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 70 years building a reputation for duty, service, and moral integrity. The idea that hidden documents could undermine that legacy felt like a personal assault on everything the family held sacred. "Who else knows about this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Too many people," Charles replied grimly. "The renovation contractor, his supervisor, several palace officials, the historians and lawyers I've consulted. Each person I've brought into the circle has been sworn to secrecy. But secrets this big have a way of finding their own path to the light." William stood and began pacing around the study, his mind racing through potential scenarios and solutions. "Have any journalists made direct contact about these specific documents?" "Not yet, but there have been inquiries. Vague questions about royal archives, requests for interviews about family history from the 1980s. The kind of fishing expeditions that suggest someone knows something but isn't ready to publish yet. They're building a story," William realized, "taking time to verify facts and gather additional sources before they go public. That means we have a window of opportunity, but probably not a very big one." Charles nodded slowly. "That's what I've been hoping. But William, I have to tell you, after 3 months of looking at this from every angle, I'm not sure there's a good way out. Every option seems to involve damaging revelations, broken trust, or constitutional crisis." William stopped pacing and looked at his father directly. "What options have you considered?" "We could try to get ahead of the story, release the documents ourselves with full context and explanation, but that means admitting to decades of secrecy and potentially contradicting official royal history." Charles picked up another paper. "We could fight legal battles to keep the documents private, claiming they fall under royal privilege or national security. But that would only delay the inevitable and make us look like we have something to hide. What about negotiating with whoever is preparing to publish? Offering access or interviews in exchange for responsible reporting?" Charles shook his head. "That assumes the motivation is journalistic integrity rather than sensationalism. And it puts us in a position of appearing to make deals with the media, which has its own set of problems." William sank back into his chair, beginning to understand why his father had been paralyzed by the situation. Every potential solution carried enormous risks, and the consequences of making the wrong choice could be catastrophic for the monarchy's future. "There's one more thing you need to know," Charles said, his voice barely audible. "Some of these documents relate to events that happened when you were young. Decisions that were made about your education, your protection, your public role. If they become public, they could raise questions about whether you were properly prepared for your future responsibilities." The personal attack implicit in this revelation hit William harder than any of the previous disclosures. It wasn't just about protecting the institution of the monarchy anymore. It was about protecting his own credibility as the future king and by extension the future of his children who would one day inherit these same responsibilities. "I need to see everything," William said firmly. "All of it. I can't help you find a solution if I don't understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Charles hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his need for help. "William, once you know everything that's in these documents, you can't unknow it. It will change how you see our family's history, and it will make you complicit in whatever decisions we make going forward." "I'm already complicit," William replied. "I'm the heir to the throne. Whatever affects the monarchy affects me and my children. I can't lead this institution effectively while living in ignorance of its secrets." Charles nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom and maturity in his son's words. He reached for the largest folder on his desk and slid it across to William. "Then we'll face this together. But I warn you, some of what you're about to read will be difficult to accept." As William opened the folder and began to read, he realized that this moment would mark a turning point not just for his father's reign, but for his own understanding of what it meant to be a member of the royal family. The documents in front of him contained 40 years of hidden truths, and once he had absorbed their contents, there would be no going back to the comfortable illusions he had carried throughout his life. The silence in the study was broken only by the soft rustle of papers as William worked his way through document after document, each revelation more shocking than the last. 3 hours had passed since he had broken down the door, and the afternoon light filtering through the windows had taken on the golden hue that preceded evening. Neither man had spoken much during this time, both lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they were facing. William set down a particularly damaging letter from 1987 and rubbed his eyes, trying to process what he had just read. It was correspondence between his grandfather and a senior government minister about influencing a vote in Parliament, written in Prince Philip's distinctive handwriting with casual references to ensuring the right outcome and applying appropriate pressure where necessary. "This goes against everything we've ever said about royal neutrality," William said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "If this becomes public, it won't just be embarrassing. It will fundamentally undermine the constitutional monarchy as we know it." Charles nodded grimly. "That's why I've been so paralyzed by this situation. It's not just about protecting our reputation anymore. It's about protecting the entire system of government that depends on the monarchy remaining above political influence." William picked up another document, this one, a detailed financial record from the late 1980s showing payments from foreign governments for what were described as consulting services. The amounts involved were substantial, and the countries making the payments included several with questionable human rights records. "Father, some of these financial arrangements, they look like they could be interpreted as selling royal influence to foreign powers. The media would have a field day with accusations of corruption." "I know," Charles replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent weeks trying to understand the context, trying to find innocent explanations. But even with the most charitable interpretation, these documents suggest a level of royal involvement in political and financial matters that the public was never told about." William continued reading, finding evidence of secret meetings with foreign dignitaries, undisclosed business relationships, and personal correspondence that revealed family members expressing strong political opinions that directly contradicted their public stance of neutrality. Each document seemed to chip away at another piece of the carefully constructed image that the royal family had spent decades building. But it was the personal documents that hit William the hardest. Among the papers were detailed reports about his own childhood, written by palace officials and discussing concerns about his readiness for his future role. There were evaluations of his academic performance, psychological assessments, and strategic discussions about how to manage his public image as he grew older. One report, dated when he was 16, discussed concerning tendencies toward independence and questioning of established protocols, and recommended increased oversight and guidance to ensure proper development of royal mindset. Reading about himself as if he were a problem to be managed rather than a young person trying to find his place in the world was deeply unsettling. "You were protecting me," William said suddenly, understanding dawning in his voice. "All those times when I felt like I was being watched, monitored, managed. You were trying to prevent exactly this kind of scrutiny." Charles looked up from his own reading, his face showing a mixture of regret and defensive justification. "We were trying to prepare you for a role that comes with impossible expectations and constant scrutiny. Every mistake you made as a young man would be magnified and analyzed. We thought if we could guide you carefully enough, you could avoid the pitfalls that had trapped other members of the family. But some of these reports make it sound like you were more concerned about controlling the narrative than about my actual well-being," William said, holding up a particularly clinical assessment of his teenage years. "This isn't preparation for leadership. This is manipulation." The accusation hung in the air between them, touching on fundamental questions about parenting, duty, and the price of royal life. Charles set down his own papers and looked directly at his son. "William, I won't pretend that every decision we made was perfect. But you have to understand the pressure we were under. The media was constantly looking for signs of weakness, dysfunction, scandal. One poorly handled situation could have destroyed your chances of ever being an effective king. So you decided to handle my entire childhood as a public relations exercise? We tried to balance your needs as a person with the requirements of your position. Sometimes those things came into conflict, and when they did, we had to prioritize the long-term stability of the institution over short-term personal preferences." William felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. "You're talking about my life, Father. My childhood, my education, my relationships. They weren't institutional requirements to be managed. They were my experiences as a human being." Charles's face softened, and for a moment he looked older and more vulnerable than William had ever seen him. "You're right to be angry. Looking back now, with the perspective of a father myself, I can see how some of our decisions must have felt controlling and manipulative. But at the time, we genuinely believed we were protecting you and preparing you for responsibilities that no amount of normal childhood could adequately address.
The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the broken door.
Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway carrying a tea tray and looking carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said formally. "I thought you might need some refreshment. Also, sir, your private secretary has been asking about your evening appointments. He's concerned about the changes to your schedule." Charles and William exchanged glances, suddenly remembering that the outside world was continuing to function while they dealt with their crisis. Charles had a dinner with Commonwealth representatives scheduled for that evening, and William was supposed to attend a charity gala with Catherine. "Please tell my secretary that I'll need to reschedule everything for today," Charles said. "Family emergency." No further explanation for now. After Mrs. Embry Henderson left, William returned to the documents with a different perspective. He was no longer just reading about abstract royal protocols and political missteps. He was reading about his own family, his own life, and the complex web of decisions and pressures that had shaped every aspect of his existence. "There's something else we need to discuss," Charles said after a long silence. The question of who was responsible for hiding these documents in the first place. Someone made a deliberate decision to keep them secret while officially reporting them as destroyed. That level of deception suggests either a cover-up of something significant or protection of someone important. William looked up from the financial records he had been studying. "Have you been able to identify who had access to that room at Frogmore House? Who would have had the opportunity and the motive to hide these papers?" "That's what's been keeping me awake at night," Charles replied. "The room was used by several family members over the years, but the timing of when these documents were hidden is crucial. Based on the dates of the most recent papers in the collection, they were all placed together sometime in the mid-1990s. "That narrows it down," William said, his analytical mind beginning to work through the possibilities. "Who was using the room during that period? Who would have had both the access and the authority to make this kind of decision?" Charles hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of his response. "Your grandmother was using the room regularly during that time for private meetings. But so was I. Occasionally. And your grandfather had some of his personal files stored there." The suggestion that Queen Elizabeth II herself might have been involved in hiding these documents was almost too difficult for William to contemplate. His grandmother had been the moral center of the family, the person whose integrity had never been questioned by anyone inside or outside the royal circle. "You don't really think grandmother was involved in covering this up, do you?" "I don't know what to think," Charles admitted.
"But William, if she was involved, if she made the decision to hide these documents, then she must have had a very good reason. Your grandmother never acted without considering the long-term consequences for the monarchy and the country."
William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where he had played as a child, where his own children now played during family visits. The weight of generational responsibility felt heavier now that he understood how many secrets had been carried by each successive generation of royals. "There's another possibility," he said slowly. "What if these documents were hidden not to cover up past mistakes, but to protect the future? What if someone knew that revealing them at the wrong time could destabilize the monarchy when it was most vulnerable?" Charles considered this perspective. "You mean they were hidden as a strategic decision rather than a panicked cover-up?" The mid-90s were a difficult period for the royal family. Divorce scandals, media criticism, questions about relevance and cost. If these documents had surfaced then, they might have been the final blow that ended the monarchy entirely. So someone made the decision to hide them until the monarchy was stronger, more stable, better able to withstand the shock of revelation? "It's possible," William said, turning back to face his father. "But if that's true, then we need to consider whether now is the right time for these secrets to come to light. Are we stronger now than we were in the 90s? Are we better positioned to handle this kind of crisis?" Charles laughed bitterly. "I wish I could say yes, but look at the current political climate. Anti-establishment sentiment, questions about inequality, demands for transparency and accountability. In some ways, we might be even more vulnerable now than we were 25 years ago." William returned to his chair and picked up the folder containing the most damaging documents. "Then we need to make a decision about how to handle this. We can't keep these secrets hidden indefinitely, especially now that other people know they exist. But we also can't simply release them without a strategy for managing the fallout. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we take control of the narrative. Instead of waiting for journalists to piece together their own version of events, we provide the full context ourselves. We acknowledge past mistakes, explain the pressures and circumstances that led to questionable decisions, and demonstrate how the monarchy has evolved and improved over time. Charles looked skeptical. That's a tremendous risk, William. Once we open this door, we can't control how far it goes. The media will demand access to other archives, other documents.
Where does it end? It ends when we've been honest about our past and shown that we're committed to transparency going forward.
Father, the alternative is to live in constant fear of exposure, to make decisions based on protecting secrets rather than serving the public interest. The two men sat in contemplative silence, each weighing the enormity of the decision they were facing. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the study where 40 years of hidden truths had finally been revealed. The broken door remained a visible reminder that some barriers once crossed could never be rebuilt in quite the same way. The emergency meeting convened at 8 o'clock that evening in the blue drawing room at Buckingham Palace brought together the most senior advisors and trusted confidants the royal family could assemble on short notice. William and Charles had spent the remainder of the afternoon organizing their thoughts and preparing for what would likely be the most consequential strategic discussion of Charles's reign.
Present at the table were Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, who had served the family for over 2 decades and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of royal protocol and crisis management. Lady Susan Hussey, despite her recent retirement, had been asked to attend due to her unparalleled understanding of royal history and her close relationship with the late Queen Elizabeth II.
The palace's senior legal counsel, Patricia Morrison, QC, sat with several thick folders containing preliminary legal analysis of the situation. Also present were the heads of royal communications, security, and the keeper of the royal archives. Before we begin, Charles said, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and determination, I want to be absolutely clear about what we're discussing tonight. The documents we've discovered don't just represent a public relations challenge. They have the potential to fundamentally alter public understanding of the monarchy's role in recent history. Sir Clive had been briefed on the general nature of the situation during the afternoon, but seeing the actual documents spread across the table clearly shocked him. His usually composed demeanor cracked slightly as he examined a letter detailing political interference from the 1980s. Your Majesty, he said carefully, some of these documents appear to contradict official royal history as it's been presented to the public for decades. If they become public without proper context, the constitutional implications could be severe. Patricia Morrison looked up from her legal analysis. From a legal standpoint, we have several potential issues. The political correspondence could be interpreted as violations of constitutional neutrality. The financial records might trigger investigations into undisclosed income or potential tax implications. Most concerning, if these documents were deliberately hidden while being officially reported as destroyed, that could constitute a criminal act. The room fell silent as the legal implications sank in. William had been concerned about public relations and political fallout, but the possibility of criminal charges against family members added an entirely new dimension to the crisis. Who would be at risk of criminal liability? Charles asked quietly. Anyone who was involved in the decision to hide these documents, Patricia replied. Depending on the specific circumstances, that could include senior staff members, private secretaries, or, she paused, clearly uncomfortable with the implication, or senior family members who had knowledge of and authority over the decision. Lady Susan Hussey spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I think we need to consider the possibility that these documents were hidden not as a cover-up, but as a protective measure during a vulnerable period for the monarchy. Her late Majesty was always thinking strategically about the long-term stability of the institution. With respect, Lady Susan, Patricia countered, the motivation behind hiding the documents doesn't change the potential legal implications. If official records were falsified, if documents that should have been preserved were reported as destroyed, those actions could constitute criminal offenses regardless of the intent. William had been listening to this exchange while studying the faces around the table. These were people who had dedicated their careers to serving the royal family, and he could see the strain in their expressions as they grappled with the magnitude of the situation.
Let's focus on our options, he said, taking control of the discussion.
We can't change what happened in the past, but we can control how we respond now. What are our realistic choices? The communications director, James Matthews, opened his folder. I've been analyzing potential strategies since this afternoon. Option 1 is full disclosure. We release all the documents ourselves, provide complete context, and control the narrative by being first to tell the story. The advantage is that we appear transparent and honest. The disadvantage is that we invite unlimited scrutiny and potentially set a precedent for releasing other sensitive historical documents. Option 2, Charles prompted. Selective disclosure. We acknowledge that documents have been found, provide summaries of their contents without releasing the full texts, and emphasize the historical context that explains any concerning elements. This gives us more control over the narrative while still appearing responsive to public interest. And option 3. James hesitated before continuing. Complete suppression. We use legal challenges, claims of royal privilege, and security concerns to prevent publication.
We argue that these documents contain sensitive information that could compromise ongoing diplomatic relationships or national security interests. Sir Clive shook his head.
Option 3 is not sustainable in the current media environment. Any attempt to suppress publication completely would only increase interest and speculation. We'd be fighting a losing battle while appearing to have something significant to hide. William picked up one of the most damaging financial documents. There's something else we need to consider. Some of these documents implicate people who are still alive, still active in public life. If we release everything, we're not just affecting the royal family, we're potentially destroying other people's reputations and careers. This added another layer of complexity to their decision. The documents contained references to government ministers, business leaders, and foreign officials who had been involved in questionable arrangements decades earlier. Many of these individuals were now senior figures in their respective fields, and their involvement in past controversies could have far-reaching consequences. We have a moral obligation to consider the impact on other people, Charles said. But we also can't let concern for others prevent us from doing what's right for the monarchy and the country. Patricia Morrison had been taking notes throughout the discussion. There's another factor we haven't fully addressed. The fact that these documents surfaced during routine renovation work means that their discovery was largely accidental. But the timing of their potential publication is not accidental. Someone has been researching this story, asking questions, building a case.
That suggests a deliberate effort to expose these secrets. You're suggesting someone has been investigating the royal family specifically? William asked.
It's possible. The questions that have been reaching the Palace Communications Office aren't random. They're targeted, specific, suggesting that someone knows exactly what they're looking for. We may be dealing with a coordinated investigation rather than opportunistic journalism.
This revelation changed the entire context of their situation.
If someone had been deliberately investigating royal family secrets, then the discovery of the hidden documents might not be coincidental at all. It could be part of a broader effort to expose royal family activities that had been kept secret for decades.
Do we know who's been asking these questions? Charles inquired. James Matthews consulted his notes. Several media organizations have made inquiries, but the most persistent has been a freelance investigative journalist named Rebecca Sterling. She's been researching royal finances and political connections for over a year, and some of her questions have been remarkably specific. William recognized the name. Rebecca Sterling had written several high-profile exposés about political corruption and financial irregularities involving public figures.
Her work was thorough, well-researched, and had led to criminal prosecutions in several cases. If Rebecca Sterling is investigating us, William said grimly, then she's not going to be satisfied with limited disclosure or public relations management.
She's going to keep digging until she finds the complete truth. Which means, Sir Clive added, that any strategy based on partial disclosure or controlled narrative is likely to fail. She'll eventually uncover the full scope of these documents, and when she does, our attempts to manage the story will be seen as deception and manipulation. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this analysis.
The presence of a skilled investigative journalist with a track record of exposing powerful people meant that their options were more limited than they had initially believed. Lady Susan Hussey spoke again, her voice carrying the authority of decades of royal service. I think we need to consider what Her late Majesty would have done in this situation. She always believed that the monarchy's strength came from its moral authority, not from its ability to hide uncomfortable truths.
She would have wanted us to choose the path that preserves that moral authority, regardless of short-term consequences. Charles looked at his longtime advisor with deep respect. Are you suggesting full disclosure? I'm suggesting honesty, Lady Susan replied. Complete honesty about what we know, about what mistakes were made, and about our commitment to ensuring that such mistakes are not repeated. The public can forgive errors in judgment, especially errors made decades ago under different circumstances. What they cannot forgive is ongoing deception. William found himself nodding in agreement. Lady Susan is right. If we try to manage this story, if we attempt to control the narrative through partial disclosure or legal challenges, we'll only confirm suspicions that the royal family operates by different rules than everyone else. Patricia Morrison looked up from her legal analysis. If you're considering full disclosure, We need to prepare for the legal consequences. Some of the activities described in these documents may trigger criminal investigations. People may face prosecution. The monarchy itself could face unprecedented legal scrutiny. Then we'll face those consequences honestly, Charles said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. We'll cooperate with any investigations, we'll accept responsibility for past mistakes, and we'll demonstrate that the monarchy is committed to the same standards of accountability that we expect from everyone else. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. Around the table, these servants of the crown who had spent their careers protecting royal family interests were now being asked to support a strategy that would expose the family to unprecedented risk. We'll need a comprehensive plan, William said, taking charge of the practical details. Legal preparation for potential investigations, communications strategy for managing public reaction, diplomatic outreach to foreign governments who might be implicated, and internal preparation for family members who will be affected by these revelations. How much time do we have? Charles asked James Matthews.
Based on the pattern of inquiries we've been receiving, I estimate that Rebecca Sterling is probably weeks away from publication rather than months. If we're going to get ahead of the story, we need to act quickly.
As the meeting concluded and advisors began to file out with their various assignments, William and Charles remained at the table, surrounded by the documents that had started this crisis. The broken door to Charles's study had been repaired, but the barriers between past and present, between secrecy and transparency, could never be rebuilt in quite the same way.
Are we doing the right thing? Charles asked his son. William looked at the papers scattered across the table, thinking about his children and the monarchy they would inherit. We're doing the honest thing, he replied. Whether it's right or wrong, history will judge, but at least we'll face that judgment with integrity.
3 weeks later, William stood at the podium in the historic ballroom of Buckingham Palace, facing a gathering of international media that represented the culmination of the most carefully orchestrated revelation in modern royal history. The decision to hold the press conference at the palace itself, rather than in a neutral venue, had been deliberate.
They were taking ownership of their story on their own ground. The intervening weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, legal consultation, and family discussions that had tested relationships and forced difficult conversations about loyalty, truth, and the price of transparency. Catherine had been brought fully into the situation, as had Princess Anne and other senior family members who would be affected by the revelations. Each conversation had been painful in its own way, but necessary for presenting a united front. The documents themselves had been meticulously organized and analyzed by a team of historians, legal experts, and archivists. Every piece of paper had been authenticated, contextualized, and prepared for public release.
The palace had worked with Rebecca Sterling directly, providing her with exclusive advance access to the complete archive in exchange for her agreement to delay publication until after the royal family's own disclosure. Ladies and gentlemen, William began, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. 3 weeks ago, during routine renovation work at one of our properties, a collection of historical documents was discovered that had been missing from the royal archives for several decades.
Today, I want to share with you what those documents contain, explain the circumstances surrounding their concealment, and outline the steps we are taking to ensure complete transparency going forward. The room was completely silent, except for the soft clicking of cameras. William had insisted on making this announcement himself, despite his father's initial reluctance to involve the heir to the throne in such a potentially damaging revelation. But William understood that the future of the monarchy depended not just on how they handled this crisis, but on who was seen to be leading the response. The documents span a period from the late 1970s to the early 1990s and contain correspondence, financial records, and internal memoranda that reveal activities by members of the royal family that were not disclosed to the public at the time. Some of these activities involved political opinions and influences that went beyond the constitutional role of the monarchy. Others involved financial arrangements that, while legal, were not properly disclosed or explained. William paused, allowing the weight of these admissions to settle over the room, because he could see reporters frantically taking notes, understanding that they were witnessing an unprecedented moment of royal transparency. I want to address directly the question of why these documents were concealed for so many years. Our investigation suggests that the decision was made in the mid-1990s during a particularly difficult period for the royal family, by individuals who believed that revealing these documents at that time could have destabilized the monarchy when the country needed stability most.
This was the most delicate part of the disclosure.
They had never been able to definitively determine who had made the decision to hide the documents, but the evidence pointed toward a collective choice involving senior family members and advisors rather than a single individual acting alone.
While we understand the protective instincts that may have motivated this decision, we recognize that concealing these documents was wrong. The public has a right to understand the full history of the institutions that serve them, including the mistakes and misjudgments that are part of that history. William gestured to a table where copies of the most significant documents were displayed for media review.
Today, we are releasing the complete archive to the public. Every document has been digitized and will be available online within hours.
We are also inviting independent historians to conduct their own analysis and provide additional context for these materials. The questions from reporters came rapidly once William opened the floor.
The first was from the BBC's royal correspondent, Your Royal Highness. Some of these documents suggest political interference that violates constitutional principles. How do you respond to accusations that the royal family has acted beyond its proper role? The documents do show instances where family members expressed strong political opinions and attempted to influence policy decisions.
These actions were inconsistent with the constitutional role of the monarchy, and we acknowledge that they were mistakes. The royal family has evolved significantly since that time, and we have implemented stricter protocols to ensure that such situations do not occur again.
Rebecca Sterling herself was in the front row, and when William called on her, she asked the question he had been dreading. Your Royal Highness, some of these financial arrangements could be interpreted as corruption. Are you prepared to face criminal investigation if law enforcement agencies determine that laws were broken? We have already been in communication with the appropriate authorities about these documents.
We will cooperate fully with any investigations that may result, and we accept that family members may face legal consequences if wrongdoing is determined to have occurred. No one is above the law, including the royal family.
The admission that family members might face criminal prosecution sent a shockwave through the room. No modern royal had ever acknowledged the possibility of criminal liability, let alone volunteered to cooperate with investigations that could result in prosecution.
A reporter from The Times asked about the impact on the monarchy's future. Given these revelations, do you believe the monarchy can maintain public trust and support? William had prepared carefully for this question, understanding that his answer would likely define public perception of the entire disclosure. Trust is earned through honesty, accountability, and commitment to serving the public interest.
We believe that by revealing these difficult truths ourselves, by accepting responsibility for past mistakes, and by demonstrating our commitment to transparency going forward, we can emerge from this period with a stronger foundation of trust than we had before. But what about the constitutional implications? Pressed a reporter from The Guardian. If the royal family has been politically active in ways that contradict constitutional principles, doesn't that fundamentally undermine the system of constitutional monarchy? Constitutional monarchy is not a static concept, William replied. It has evolved throughout history as society's expectations and democratic principles have developed.
These documents show that previous generations of royals operated under different understandings of their role. We believe that acknowledging these differences and committing to contemporary constitutional principles actually strengthens the system, rather than undermining it.
The most difficult question came from a foreign correspondent who asks about the impact on international relationships. Some of these documents implicate foreign governments and officials in questionable arrangements.
How will this affect Britain's diplomatic relationships? We have been in communication with the governments of all countries referenced in these documents. While some of these revelations may cause temporary diplomatic difficulties, we believe that honest acknowledgement of past issues provides a better foundation for future relationships than continued secrecy.
As the press conference continued, William found himself feeling increasingly confident about their decision. The questions were tough, but they were also fair. The reporters seemed to respect the unprecedented nature of the royal family's disclosure, even as they pressed for complete answers. Near the end of the session, a reporter asked about the personal cost of this disclosure.
Your Royal Highness, this must have been an enormously difficult decision for your family.
How has this process affected you personally? For the first time during the press conference, William allowed his prepared statements to give way to personal reflection. It has been one of the most challenging periods of my life. Learning that your family's history contains elements that contradict everything you believed about their integrity and principles is deeply painful. But it has also been liberating in many ways. We no longer have to live in fear of these secrets being exposed. We can focus entirely on serving the public rather than protecting ourselves from our past.
The final question came from a young journalist who asked about the future. What do you want people to remember about this moment in royal history? William considered the question carefully before answering. I want people to remember that when faced with a choice between protecting ourselves and being honest with the public, We chose honesty.
I want them to remember that the monarchy is an institution run by imperfect people who are capable of making mistakes, but who are committed to learning from those mistakes and serving the country with integrity. As the press conference concluded and reporters filed out to write their stories, William remained at the podium for a moment, looking out at the empty chairs where history had been made. His phone was already buzzing with messages from family members, advisors, and political figures responding to the revelation. Charles appeared at his side, having watched the entire press conference from a side room.
"How do you feel?" he asked his son, terrified and relieved at the same time. William replied honestly, "We've just changed the royal family forever. We'll never be able to go back to the old ways of managing crises through secrecy and silence."
"No," Charles agreed. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Your grandmother always said that the monarchy had to evolve to survive. Perhaps this is our evolution."
Over the following days, the public reaction proved to be more complex and nuanced than anyone had anticipated. While there was significant criticism and calls for Republican reforms, there was also widespread praise for the royal family's unprecedented transparency. Editorial writers struggled to balance their shock at the revelations with their respect for the courage it took to reveal them voluntarily. The legal investigations that followed were thorough but ultimately concluded that while some past actions had been ethically questionable, the passage of time and changes in legal standards made criminal prosecution unlikely. More importantly, the investigations found no evidence of ongoing impropriety, confirming that the royal family's claim of reform and evolution was genuine. 6 months after the broken door at Clarence House had started everything, William stood in his study at Kensington Palace reading the morning newspapers with a sense of cautious optimism. The monarchy had survived its greatest crisis of transparency, and while some damage had been done to historical reputations, the institution itself had emerged stronger and more trusted than before. The documents that had once threatened to destroy the royal family had ultimately become the foundation for a new kind of monarchy, one based on honesty rather than mystique, accountability rather than privilege, and service rather than secrecy. It wasn't the monarchy that previous generations had envisioned, but it was one that could face the future with integrity. The broken door had been repaired, but the barriers it represented had been permanently removed, and in their place stood something unprecedented in royal history. A crown that derived its authority not from hidden power, but from transparent service to the people it was meant to serve.
Palace silent, tension high. Prince William forced to break the door.